Hi everyone, and welcome to the second in our series of bite-sized webinars on home working. I'm Alex Fisher, one of the partners in the Employment and Business Immigration team here at Travers Smith, and joining me today is Kulsoom Hadi, a Knowledge Counsel from our Remuneration and Incentives team. And that's because in today's webinar, we're going to be focusing on equipment and expenses. So what are your obligations as an employer to provide equipment, and what are the tax implications of providing kit or reimbursing expenses? And I'm very grateful Kulsoom is with us to talk to those tax points. In our last session, we focused on the employer's health and safety obligations with respect to home working, and the recording is still available if you haven't had a chance to listen yet. Today, we're going to follow a very similar Q&A format. So kicking off with our first question, which I'll pick up. What equipment do you have to provide for employees working from home? As a starting point then, employers are not legally required to provide equipment for home working. There is no general legal obligation to provide equipment, but there are lots of reasons you might decide to provide at least something. So, for example, many employers do provide basic IT equipment to enable the employee to do their job from home, such as a company phone or a laptop. This might be to make sure the equipment is compatible with the employee's IT systems, it's secure and has got adequate virus protection, because you will obviously be concerned about protecting things like confidential information and personal data. Some employers are also thinking about providing additional equipment to protect privacy, such as privacy screens or shredders. There is perhaps also a quality assurance angle here, particularly for customer-facing staff. You want to make sure that the laptop and phone are fast and reliable for client calls and things like that. And there's also a disability discrimination angle. You of course have a duty to make reasonable adjustments for any staff who might be disabled. And this might extend to providing particular equipment, for example, an ergonomic chair for someone with ongoing back issues. So it's worth engaging with employees who currently have adjustments in place to identify if any revised adjustments might be necessary. And perhaps also remind staff to tell you if they think that they need any reasonable adjustments due to any disability that they may have. So, Kulsoom, if as an employer, you choose to provide employees with equipment like a laptop and mobile phone, what are the tax implications?
Thanks, Alex. So the tax implications will depend on the type of equipment provided, because the taxation of mobile phones is slightly different to other forms of office equipment. So an employer can provide an employee with a single mobile phone, and that will not be subject to income tax or national insurance contributions. And that will cover the phone itself, the line rental, and the cost of all calls. And there's no limit on how that phone can be used. So you can use your phone for personal calls as well as work-related calls. There's no limit on that. And if the individual already has a phone that they particularly like, you can provide a SIM card, and that also will be exempt. So that's a very wide-ranging exemption specifically for mobile phones. The position for other forms of office equipment is slightly different and more complicated. So if you provide your employees with things like a tablet or a Surface Pro or a special chair, or even sort of a table, things like that, extra screens, those can be tax-free, but the conditions that need to be met to come within the tax and NICS relief are a little more stringent. And so the requirements are that equipment is provided solely for working from home, and any private use is what's called not significant. And there's no actual definition of what not significant is. And clearly, when you've got employees working at home, it's very difficult to check whether or not they are what they're using the equipment for. But the government, so the revenue, takes quite a pragmatic approach to it and says that effectively, if employers have communicated a policy to employees that clearly sets out the circumstances in which they can use the equipment and makes it clear that either any private use is prohibited or must not be significant, then they will generally take the view that you've met that condition. So it's quite important that companies put in place policies which set out, first of all, making it clear that the equipment is being provided specifically to enable them to work at home, and that there should either be no private use of the equipment or that any private use should be limited. And also make it clear as well that quite clear that the ownership of the equipment rests with the employer, and that if for any reason you stop working from home or you leave the company, that it's expected that it will be returned to the employer. So communication is key here. And in terms of what might be covered by significant use, I think, practically speaking, it's probably fine for an employee to, do an online shop while they're working, or maybe check a few personal emails, or even sort of surf the web during their lunch break. But I think that would be very different to maybe once their working day is finished, switching on their laptop, say, to stream Netflix or something like that. So I think that's the sort of difference that you need to draw. But so the policy is very important from that perspective.
Thanks, Costume. Yeah, policy, I think, a great consideration when you're thinking about these sorts of things. So what if the employee goes out and they buy equipment themselves, like a printer or a scanner? Do you have to reimburse them for that? And if you do, what are the tax implications?
I mean, I don't think you have to reimburse them, but if you do reimburse them, if the employer does reimburse them, then the general rule is that reimbursement payment is taxable. It's a sort of benefit that is subject to income tax and NICs. There are only very limited circumstances, generally speaking, in which you can claim tax relief for any benefit of reimbursed expenses. Because the conditions that need to be met are very, very restrictive, and usually, a condition is that everybody who held that employment would have to incur that expense. Now, clearly, most jobs aren't created on the basis that they can only be carried out at home, so you probably fall at that first hurdle. However, in recognition of the fact that a lot of people are having to work at home due to COVID-19, the government has introduced a temporary form of tax relief. So they have said that where an employer does reimburse expenses to allow people to work from home due to the COVID-19 crisis, then for amounts reimbursed from the 16th of March 2020 to the end of the tax year, provided there is no significant private use of the equipment that is purchased, and also provided that everybody is offered, all employees are offered that benefit on the same terms, the reimbursement will not trigger income tax and NICs. So there are a number of sort of practical things that you need to think about here, because clearly, I mean, the tests are very similar to the tests that need to be met where you actually, as an employer, provide the equipment. But it's quite difficult to impose restrictions on how somebody uses something that they have gone out and bought and actually belongs to them. So how you assess a significant private use in those circumstances is quite challenging. This exemption was brought in obviously quite quickly in response to an emergency situation. So hopefully the revenue will take a fairly light touch approach with how they police it. But I think, again, if companies employers have time now, because obviously some of this expense will have been incurred already, but if they have time, they certainly should think about creating a policy which makes it clear that, first of all, if you want to buy something, you get sign off from the employer that it's okay to buy it. You make it clear that you are only going to use it for work-related home working expenses, and that you have a policy in place to make it clear what happens if somebody leaves. So if somebody leaves shortly after buying the equipment, do you then say, well, actually, we would like that money back, please, because you haven't used the equipment for working at home, and so we need to have the money back. So again, a policy is very important, and also as an employer, you would probably want to put a cap on how much you're going to reimburse. Obviously, it helps if people can, are required to ask you first before they actually buy the item, but you might want to sort of put a cap on it. and you also have to make sure that this all employee requirement is met. And so if, for example, a lot of employees have, senior managers just said, oh, please could I have a laptop to work from home? If you then reimburse the expense of that laptop, but other employees didn't know about the ability to ask for a laptop or to ask for their expenses being reimbursed, you might not fail that. You might not pass that test. You might fail that all-employee test. So it needs to be sort of managed quite carefully. But this is a temporary exemption that will only last to the end of the tax year. And so if you have you've gone out and bought something and had the expense reimbursed, and then you're using it for work at the end of the tax year, the question is, how much beyond the end of the tax year do you need to continue to use it for business purposes to avoid any sort of suggestion that the tax relief should be clawed back? I mean, pragmatically, you would hope that a line would be drawn at the end of the tax year, but that's something that we probably need guidance on.
Thanks, Colleen. So sticking with equipment for a second, what happens if the employee leaves? So assuming that it's the company that owns the equipment, but the company is prepared to let the employee keep that laptop or phone, what's the implications there?
It's relatively straightforward in that there is a taxable benefit equal to the market value of the equipment at the time that they leave. Obviously you need to make it clear that the starting point is that you will take the equipment back, but if you do want to let them have it, then there is a tax charge on the market value of the item when they go. And companies should be quite careful about making sure they keep an inventory of the equipment that they've given to people, so they know when they do leave what they need back. I mean, that probably doesn't need to go as far as checking, how, small items like, a mouse or a cable or something like that. But obviously the things with significant value, you would need to monitor those. And if they're allowed to keep them, then yes, that would give rise to a tax charge and Class 1A NICs.
Okay, and so what about broadband? So if the employee doesn't already have broadband set up at home and the employer agrees to pay for the setup, is that going to be taxable?
If the individual doesn't currently have broadband, then the setup charge can be paid for by the employer without incurring tax and NICs, on the basis that the broadband is needed for primarily for business use. If they've already got broadband and you just want super fast broadband or some other form of broadband, then if you pay for that will be a benefit in kind. So it depends. But it has to be for business use in both cases.
Okay, and then one of the questions we get asked most is around expenses. So who pays for things like additional heating and electricity or phone or broadband usage? So does the employer have to cover this? So again, as I said before, there's no obligation on employers to cover these expenses for home workers. This might come down to existing expenses policy and whether you would ordinarily reimburse employees for expenses incurred in the performance of their role. The problem with things like heating and electricity is that it is difficult, if not impossible, to quantify what is personal use and what is business use. Some employers are taking the view that the reduced costs of not having to commute outweigh any additional heating or electricity costs and are not offering any contribution to this. Others are deciding to offer a small contribution. So, Kulsoom, if the employer does want to contribute something to heating, electricity or broadband expenses, can it do so, and what are the tax implications?
Well, there is actually an exemption for those sorts of additional expenses for home workers, so that already exists. And when people first started to work from home, there were a lot of commentators saying, everyone should be able to take advantage of this. So basically, because it's difficult to work out how much more you're having to pay for your on gas, electricity, and all the rest of it for working at home. The revenue accept that if the employer makes a reasonable contribution to your additional household expenses due to home working, then that is you know, that is fine. And they say you don't have to work out exactly how much it is. We will say you can pay £6 per week. And so every employer could have, working at home, could be given £6 per week, which is broadly £300 a year, tax-free as a contribution to their home working expenses. If they, and that will cover, you know, there's no definition of what home working expenses is, but is expected to cover things like gas, electricity and broadband. And the revenue has specifically confirmed that although normally that exemption is only available in respect of home working arrangements, which have a specific definition and might not ordinarily cover people just working temporarily due to COVID-19, they have said that specifically it will apply in relation to people unexpectedly working from home due to COVID-19. And even if you know, if you can identify how much more you're spending specifically, then again, this exemption, you can actually claim for that specified amount. But if you can't identify it, then there is a sort of £6 flat rate per week, which you can give to every employee, which a lot of employers have been encouraged to do.
Thanks, Kalsoon.
Yeah.
I guess one of the key points that comes out of this is that it's worth being clear with your employees what sort of equipment and expenses are going to be covered and what costs they will actually bear themselves. Mm-hmm. And I guess that comes down to things like your policies and communication with staff. Both of those issues actually we're planning to cover in our third webinar on some of the wider employment implications on home working. So do look out for that. In the meantime, if you have any queries about anything that we've covered, do get in touch. Our contact details are there on the slide. That wraps up everything we're planning to say. So it just leaves me to say thanks for listening and thanks to Kalsoon for joining us, and bye for now.